Hi, 101 students or 1A students. We are continuing on current issues. This is lecture 2, and I'll be covering chapters 3 and 4. I'll also go over what you need to do for the notes at the end of each chapter, okay? So you have to examine an essay. And I'll be doing that modeling 1. I won't be writing it the way you will, but I will be telling you very directly how to do it. Okay, so chapter 3, you should have taken away from the first lecture about argument. Remember, just to say something's valid or a valid argument really is not very instructive or good or interesting in terms of this course or academic writing, because you need to have a sound argument, and which means you need to add proof for your assumptions or your premises in your argument. Okay, so a valid point or a valid argument just means the structure is okay, the conclusion follows from the premises, or the point is valid that you're making. So really, in terms of academic writing and where we're going, you need to have sound arguments, which means the conclusion follows from the premises. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a valid argument. And then your job is to, in your paper, in the body of your paper, to make sure that you prove your premises. All humans are mortal. Okay, how are you going to substantiate that? Socrates is a human, so you would have to find proof, that Socrates actually existed and that Socrates is not your cat, because then, of course, the premise or your assumption about Socrates would be false, because Socrates is actually your cat, your orange cat, rather than the historical person. Okay, so again, argument is what's important. And where do we get to with chapter 3, understanding rhetorical appeals? So this is going to cover ethos, pathos, logos. So I have to say on page 76, I rather disagree with the authors. They're trying to distinguish between persuasion and argument. They say persuasion is the broader term, but I think argument is the broader term here. And of course, persuasion can be kind of moral and immoral. So by giving reasons, argument, logic, by appealing to the emotions. So appeal to emotions can be kind of unethical, okay? Because let's say it's a commercial on TV, you're showing all these cats and dogs that have been abused, that are sick, and really they're just trying to raise money. And so are they really? They're trying to make you feel bad. But remember also, emotional appeals, they don't last as long. So things like, think about how we're convinced by a child crying or an adult crying at a whatever school board meeting, and how that can be really convincing in the short term. But later on, you think, was that woman really crying, or was that fake, And so nowadays you have to be super vigilant with people pulling tricks on you. So I think you want to be wary of emotional appeals, but also character appeals. And so the chapter has a lot of the tricks. Maybe it's the next chapter, but it mentions Donald Trump and all that. So I'm going to leave that out. I'm not going to discuss his zany antics and his tricks. But I am going to mention what a prominent philosopher, Alistair McIntyre, says that basically modern Western societies are all based on manipulation. So we're told kind of subtly, if you don't do this at your job, you're going to get in trouble. Okay? Or you're going to get in trouble with the state if you don't do this, don't do that. So, I mean, they don't give reasons. They're telling you you're going to be in trouble. You're going to get fined. Well, that's kind of a manipulation. What's the reason for whatever, paying more taxes on your filling up your tank with gasoline? Okay. Or, if you don't pay your plates or DNV on time, then you're going to get a fine, a substantial fine by the next day if you don't pay it. So I think it's something to think about whether contemporary Western societies in particular are really based on manipulation. And think about your job, think about family life even. Whether it's more based on manipulation than it is on giving reasons, rationality, what I would call the dialectic, where you go back and forth, different people arguing different things, and then the group comes to a conclusion at the end, instead of the way we do school board meetings or board meetings. They listen to people from the audience, but they don't respond. Okay, well, that's not dialectic. They would have to respond. They would have to be able to respond. They don't want to respond because they want to just limit it. And then they go behind closed doors usually and make a decision on whatever certain issues. And some issues are open to the public where they vote right there. But I think so. Our structure isn't even based on really sound argument or persuasion. It's more based on manipulation. So that's something that we need to change. Okay, let's move on. So appeals, logos, which I think is still the best and doesn't rely as much on character, ethos, and of course not on emotion, but they can work together too. You could have facts, statistics that are very emotional about whatever child abuse today, or the effect of divorce on kids. So statistics, the emotional appeals kind of go together, okay? But I'm just saying be wary of the blatant use of emotional appeals, and also of ethos, the character appeals that leaders, politicians, Machiavellians use to convince us more, trust me, have confidence in me. Look, I'm a clean person. I'm multicultural, whatever. So be wary of those kinds of claims. I want to see it. I don't want to hear it. I don't even need to look at it. What I want to do is see the reasons that are offered and evaluate those. Always evaluate the assumptions of a speaker or an article, essay, blog, Twitter post, tweet, whatever. Okay, so go to page 78. So it talks about different methods, thinking critically, evaluating ethos, character. So I think study that carefully. Also look at the visuals on 79. It talks logos, pathos, ethos. So take a close look at these. Then it goes into Trump's stuff on page 80. I'm going to skip that and then go to page 82. Unethical uses of rhetorical appeals. So when you're trying to trick people, when you make up statistics, when you lie, when you manipulate, then those are unethical appeals. And I know the Western world, we largely kind of pretend to believe in ethics, but we don't really practice them. We do in front of other people. We kind of pretend, but we don't really have what's called, ethics. And so that's also unfortunate, and I think we should change that. Okay? So tricking people, I mean, that's unethical. So that's what's being discussed on page 84. Tricking people, lying, exaggerating, all of these are, unethical. And a lot of fallacies are, uh, a lack of sound argument, which goes back to your assumptions have to be true. You need to prove your assumptions. Don't expect people to accept them. Okay. All right. Then on page 84, it goes into non-rational appeals, satire, irony, sarcasm that can also be used. And so if you're familiar with the African American writer, W.E.B. Du Bois, it's French, so it should be Du Bois, of the bois in French means woods. Okay, but they say Du Bois. But anyway, so that if you're familiar with his work, then you will see the use of humor, ridicule, irony, satire are criticized. And that's something I need to read up on. So I'm not really familiar with his writing and all, but I will address that. Okay, so Shakespeare brings in Shakespeare. I am familiar with what's said here about the play Julius Caesar, where one of the lines of the poem, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. But of course, that's not really true. So it's a speech by Antony, and he says that really, and he's showing Caesar's toga that has the holes in it from the shank wounds, right? Blood. So that's using really a prompt and very emotional appeal there. So did he just come to bury Caesar? No, he came to praise him and have the people turn against the Senate and the senators and the killers of Caesar. Okay. Even though were Caesar's motives good, Julius Caesar, not really. So what do you do when you've got two bad options there, right? Either supporting Caesar or supporting the Senate and the assassins. So that's a lot of bad options. Okay. Some would say it's kind of similar, Trump or Biden. You got two bad options. So I'm hoping we can think beyond these limitations onto better solutions. And of course, using the dialectic, which is the method of argument, going back and forth, letting different people speak, different voices, and then coming to conclusions about what's being said and argued. Okay. All right. And of course, examining assumptions. Let's move on. So emotional appeals on page 88 goes into emotional appeals. Be sure to read that. And it's talking about premarital sex and one of the examples. So, of course, they're trying to get your attention. That's for sure. So you're going to have to read one of the essays in here carefully and evaluate it. You should read all of these. Lots of good points. So what I'm going to do is go now to the back of the end of chapter 3, page 99. So we're already making progress in this textbook. We've covered basically 100 pages already. So it says assignment for rhetorical analysis. Choose one essay from the chapter to investigate how the author makes his or her argument. So what do you need to consider? What's the writer's claim or thesis? Who is the writer's audience? What is the writer's purpose? ethos, pathos, logos, what type of support is offered, what emotions are evoked, how does the writer establish credibility, are the writer's strategies effective? Okay, so I'm going to focus on the essay by Jeffrey T. Brown, The Yelling of the Lambs. So I'm going to give you a model of how to respond and how to do the activities at the end of the book here. Okay, so his claim, the lambs are the people, the Parkland. What was the name of the high school? Again, he doesn't. I don't think he mentions. So remember the Parkland shooting in Florida, where a mentally disturbed student came back. I think he had graduated, and he was already one that had made threats, and nobody really followed up. Nobody made sure that there were no guns in his house and all that. So the point of the essay is the yelling of the lambs, not to listen to young people, basically, in terms of the Second Amendment, gun rights, that their whole movement to try to influence gun legislation in Congress has made a bunch of unfair appeals, that kids don't really have the ability to reason. They don't understand the Constitution. They don't understand that there are law-abiding citizens who own guns, although the author fails to mention that most guns in the U.S. are unregistered. Only something like 1 million guns are registered. So we've got tens of millions of guns in the country that are not registered. And so that's a problem. And so the author, he kind of demonizes young people and needs to realize that when you're 18, you can vote. So, and he's really pinning a lot of the blame on progressives. So that really means members of the Democratic Party with a capital D. And so that's who he's picking on. His audience, Jeffrey Brown, so it's an online libertarian magazine called American Thinker, where he published this essay, The Yelling of the Lambs. So he's appealing mainly to libertarian readers who believe that the less government, the better. So I think it would be appropriate to even talk about how libertarianism, progressives in the U.S., yes, they have their limitations. So do, say, Republicans or what other political party, Green Party. Libertarians also have their limitations because the Constitution is explicit about certain things, but then it's not explicit about other things, like the types of guns that we use today was not even thought of by the founding fathers when they wrote the Second Amendment. Okay, so I think libertarians, by and large, believe that the Constitution is a fixed document. It's not changeable. It's not open to new interpretations. But I think the case of the Second Amendment shows that it needs to be. The Second Amendment and the Constitution is not a fixed document. The founders did not even consider anything beyond the old-fashioned muskets that shoot, one lead ball at a time. And so we've got an issue, and there are other issues and other amendments too. I mean, and the other point about libertarianism and the amendments to the Constitution, they're not absolute rights. We don't have an absolute right to freedom of speech. Okay, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And the same with guns. You can't bring guns just any old place. Okay, college campuses, for example, no guns. Nobody should have a gun. Okay, and so We can restrict. Your church, your place of worship probably has restrictions too. No guns, no weapons in a place of worship. Okay, so there are limitations that we should accept. And the same with freedom of assembly. When a judge knows that there's going to be a problem, a potential riot, whatever, Antifa versus a bunch of white supremacists, then that judge can limit and require a permit for a demonstration or whatever. And so the judge can refuse to sign it and then say, therefore, that's unlawful assembly. Because when you're talking about potential violence, people killing each other, and we've seen that in Charlottesville already, someone was killed, I think got run over. We need to look for that too. I mean, why should someone give up their life, in a peaceful march? It should be peaceful, but when it's not, then the judge has to step in. Okay. And not sign it. Okay. So there are limitations. So what are the limitations? His audience is more of a libertarian, anti-progressive, and so he's kind of just speaking to his own audience, which I think is rather ineffectual, because we need to reach new audiences. Okay. So anybody could reach Trump's audience and be a Trump supporter. Anybody could be a Biden supporter and reach that audience, a progressive. Okay. So now we need to convince people on more things, Second Amendment for sure. Also global warming. We need some kind of collective action, not just our country, but, all countries really. And so that's why collective actions is so important in terms of global warming. If you believe the theory, we'll get into that later in the semester. I will show you the articles by the scientists back in the 80s and 90s, both from Shell Oil and Exxon Oil, and we'll evaluate their articles. They came up with the theory, I think, of global warming. So it's a closed system, and then greenhouse gases get stuck in it, like the Earth and its atmosphere is a greenhouse, right? So if you know about greenhouses and how that works, then you kind of see. And so we'll be evaluating that and looking at other arguments. Okay, so I hope I've said enough about page 99 and 100, the end of the chapter. Pick a different essay from what I did, or if you want to evaluate the yelling of the lambs, then it probably should be different from mine. There's also there's a whole bunch of good essays in here. 96, the case for a national 1-week vacation. So you can evaluate that. It's very short. Okay, let's move on to chapter 4. And again, I want to mention, I brought up greenhouse gases, global warming, because this could come into play when we have confirmation bias. If you're already looking for something, then it's going to be easier to kind of come to that conclusion. So, for example, if a Martian comes up and hits me, knocks me down, takes my wallet, and then I see another Martian in town, I may think, oh, this guy's a criminal. This guy's, not only is he a Martian, but they're also the people that take wallets, hit you over the head and take your wallet. So that's kind of the mentality we need to avoid when we're dealing with life in the big city. Okay. All right. Types of reasoning. We've covered that. It does have some graphics on page 106, deductive arguments, inductive. So remember, deductive goes from general, like humans, all humans, such and such, like with the Socrates example, whereas induction goes with an example, and then draws a general conclusion. So remember the one I did in lecture 1 about inductive arguments. Toyota makes a good car, Honda makes a good car, Subaru makes a good car. Therefore, Japanese cars are good cars. Okay? So that's inductive when you're going from specific examples to drawing a general conclusion. Now, again, which method, inductive or deductive, is more reliable as far as sound arguments? Well, deductive. But you're going to find most arguments are not deductive, they're inductive. And even what you do in a research paper or what we do in science class are experiments, collecting data, all of that are inductive arguments, which are pretty weak. So I think I want to stop and address people from science who think that the scientific method is superior. Well, it's based on models, it's based on induction, and therefore it has serious limitations. So in philosophy, I know they use thought experiments. There's the example of the trolley experiment here. That's kind of limited because you can always think of some thought experiment that's going to show what you want. So it's pretty limited. So let's go back to inductive and deductive for a minute. Look on page 113. Let's read a couple of these together, and then you should do these on your own too. So is this an inductive or deductive argument? It is a crime to enter the subway without first paying. If I jump the turnstiles, I will be breaking the law. Okay? So notice the general statement. It is a crime to enter the subway without first paying. So it goes from general to specific, so it's actually deductive. What about the next one? I usually see guards posted by the subway turnstiles. If I try to jump the turnstiles, I'm going to get caught. Okay. So that one I think would be inductive. I usually see. So you're starting with an observation, one instance, and then you're drawing a general conclusion there. Okay. How about the third one? My friend staying at the Marks Hotel reported seeing a ghost in her room. That hotel must be haunted. Okay. So what do you have? You have an instance, basically seeing a ghost, and then you're making a general statement about that location, that it's haunted by ghosts. Okay, there must be other ghosts too, or other people may see them. So that is an inductive argument. Okay, so see if you can do the next three on your own and evaluate those. So notice also definitions. That's kind of tricky. And of course, you don't want to definitions can be kind of like assumptions or axioms too, so you got to be careful how things are defined because it may already be able to lead someone to the conclusion they want to get to. And so that's kind of tricky and maybe an unfair way to do things. Okay. All right. So take a look at that section on definitions. Sufficient and necessary conditions. Watch for synonyms. Okay. Problems with that. Watch for equivocation. So when you equivocate, you change the term. Donald Trump said he was asked about the dreamers, meaning those that were brought to the U.S. By their parents illegally. And instead of focusing on that issue, the dreamers, he changed it and said, we are all dreamers. So that changes the definition of what it is to be a dreamer, and so he has different ideas about it. Okay, let's move on then. So analyzing definitions, page 118, take a look at that. Experimentation, I talked a little bit about this in science. So I think especially those that have scientism of the will, so to speak, they believe in the scientific method. They don't believe in literature. They don't believe in philosophy. They think everything is science, is truth. Well, it's based on induction. It's unreliable. It's based on data that can be changed. You want to have studies that confirm what you've shown. And so that's why I think, global warming is a difficult thing to prove. So you have to define your system, that closed system, the Earth and the atmosphere, and go from there. But it's not 100% provable. So there are always going to be those that doubt global warming and don't want to do anything. But if we wait and have more CO2 in the oceans and warm the temperatures and melt more ice, but of course some say it's irreversible, so that's another issue. Okay, now authority or authoritative testimony, and that comes in science too, and in courtrooms, experts. So who would be look on page 125, who would be an expert witness in terms of recreational marijuana? So you can't just plug in any old person there. So the same with, say, COVID, whatever. Could you put Bill Gates' name in there? Not really, because he's more of a leader of programming, Microsoft. I don't think he's really an expert on COVID, or let alone Alzheimer's disease. Okay. So just because someone's interested in a project, that doesn't mean they're an expert on that. Okay. All right. So let's move along here. Now look on page 129, assumptions. So again, you can have explicit or implicit assumptions. So we really need to be careful of our assumptions and state them as assumptions. So make your arguments clear. Don't try to have 100% foolproof argument when, all of us make assumptions. So you have to say what your assumptions are, explain them, and go from there. Okay, so the essay that I'm going to look at here in this chapter, since the end of the chapter is on page 150. So here's what you're supposed to do. Choose one of the essays in this book. Well, to make it this chapter, okay, chapter 4. Discuss the strongest and weakest points of the argument's reasoning, as well as procedures, methods, induction, deduction, definitions, evidence, examples provided, rationalization, confirmation bias, counter-arguments, counter-examples. Okay, are there any? And also, I forgot to mention analogies, that it's a way to discuss an issue by making an analogy, the one they use in the book. Just as the Roman Empire eventually fell apart, so the U.S. is falling apart as well and being replaced by China or someone else. Okay, so that's tricky. Very tricky stuff. So you probably don't want to use too many analogies. Okay, the essay, however, that I want to talk about, evaluate the way you have to evaluate one of these essays in chapter 4 with the end of the chapter activities, is on page 139 by John E. Finn. So the Constitution doesn't have a problem with mask mandates. So he goes into that, so that's pretty clear what his thesis is. You could talk about audience a little bit. So he's trying to reach those people who were really obsessed with that making people wear masks was unconstitutional. Okay, so he goes into the objections right away. It violates people's constitutional rights to require masks in public places or their place of work or worship, closing churches and all that. So again, remember what I said earlier about the amendments, that they're not absolute. So we don't have an absolute right to, spread disease if someone has whatever disease. Okay. So, I mean, remember Charlie Sheen with STDs or AIDS, or, well, not AIDS, it was the precursor to that. And the fact that he spread that to other people without telling them, so he was found liable in court. So I don't think we have a right to spread disease. Our medical people can make recommendations that we follow in certain circumstances. So, I mean, if you want right to life, then of course you don't want to give people the right to spread diseases either. So there's another way to look at this. There's not just one way of masks and so-called Costco Karen who refused to wear a mask. So I think he's going from, it says here, all constitutional rights are subject to the government's authority to protect the health, safety, welfare of our community. So that's going from really general powers, okay? Because if we don't have health and we're all sick, then of course we're not going to have any constitutional rights because we're all going to be sick and dead or in hospital. All right. So rights are conditional. So this is basically what he's saying. And it's what I have thought previously in talking about chapter 3 as well. Okay. Counter arguments. Yeah, I don't think, wearing a mask, it doesn't limit your free speech. It doesn't limit your assembly. You could still go places. Now, the one thing it doesn't answer is like closing down places of worship, which happened. The government did do that in the U.S. and, of course, lots of other countries too. Like China was a lot more heavy-handed about making people stay indoors and everything than the U.S. On lockdowns, nobody ever told me, I couldn't go to the store to get groceries or go for a walk in the park, whatever. Okay. So I think, kind of lost my train of thought there. This thought that, because you have a mask on, that you lose your speech or lose your right to go in public, that's just not true. Okay. So I think there's a problem with the argument somewhere, and so that's what we need to point out. Okay, so I think I've given you enough pointers. I've carried on too long for these lectures for chapters 3 and 4, so make sure you take away something from the end of the chapters, examine, carefully write, and respond to chapters 3 and chapter 4. Pick out an essay from each one and respond, and look at the thesis or what the author's trying to show. Look at their evidence for their argument. Look for any assumptions they have. Consider their audience, and consider, criticisms, objections to what they're saying too. Okay, that's enough. Talk to you soon. Bye.